You're listening to Crossing the Atlantic, and I'm sharing with you the lessons that I've learned from 20 years of doing transatlantic business, working with hundreds of companies, so you can avoid the six-figure mistakes that most of them paid to learn the hard way. I'm Christina Rebuffet-Broadus, and welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about what I call the alignment trap. So a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from one of the French client CEO of a company that I'm working with. I had a quick look and I saw that the timestamp said he was sending me this email at 1:09 a.m. The subject line was just "On peut se parler," or in English, "Can we talk?" Question mark. Four little words in French, four words, three words in English. Anyway, just a few words. There was really no context there. And, I've been working with this guy for a while. I know that he is not the kind of person who sends emails with a short, enigmatic subject lines. And so I saw that and oh my goodness, my heart dropped. And I was like, what did I do wrong? Something's wrong here. Now, is it me or what is it? I don't know, but there's something wrong. And to give you a little bit of background, this guy, he's running an industrial company. It's done very well in Europe, and hats off to the work that they've done there already. And they're trying to build up their, a real U.S. presence now. And a while back, he had gone over to New York for a couple of days, a series of meetings with potential clients, partners, investors, that kind of thing. And when he came back, he said the meetings had gone incredibly well. The Americans that he had met, they had been very excited. They told him that, they were all aligned. They told him that they wanted to move forward. And so he came back here to France, told his board that the deal was as good as done, and started planning, their recruitment strategy to start managing this US growth that was on the brink of happening. And then what happened, a couple weeks went by, and then it was more weeks, and that kind of turned into, a month or two, and there was no contract, that nothing had been signed. There was no answer to his last three emails. We tried calling, just kind of no response there. And so we got on a call the next day and, had a chat about it. And he said he was about to have to let go of his head of U.S. development. Now, he thought that she had been doing something wrong on the follow-up, on the relationship. Something was going wrong here. And she hadn't done anything wrong. I mean, she probably didn't do everything perfectly, but nobody does everything perfectly. That wasn't the issue, let's say. She'd done everything right, as much as, anyone can do in that kind of job. The deal had really, when we kind of looked at it, the deal had died for, reasons that didn't have anything to do with them, really. It was just, two competent professionals kind of using the same words, things like moving forward, aligned, etc. But it meant two different things, and nobody in the room had just caught that difference. And that gap is what I want to talk about today, because it shows up in almost every transatlantic deal that I work on. The people who get burned by it tend to be the careful ones, not the careless ones. They prepared, they took the meeting seriously, they invested, and they did everything that they thought they were supposed to do. But they get burned because they were running on their own operating system without realizing that the people on the other side of the Atlantic were running on an entirely different operating system. And I've talked about this in some of the previous podcasts and newsletters, this idea of operating systems, two operating systems running on the same interface. And the interface looks identical on both sides of the Atlantic. It looks very similar. We've got kind of the same references. We're speaking the same language. We dress and we look the same. We're using the same software, read the same airline magazines, flying over to the other's country. But underneath that, the rules for how a decision actually gets made follow a very different logic on each side. So we're going to look at this in this episode today. We're going to look at decision-making specifically. Now, In the next episode, I'll give you a little bit of a preview on that. In 2 weeks, we're going to go deeper into what people actually mean when they say yes. And you can't get to yes until you understand the system that yes lives inside. So I want to start here with talking about that system. Now, here's the first thing that surprises my American clients when they start working in, for example, France or Germany. And I don't want to say in Europe, just because Europe is a lot of different countries with a lot of different languages and a lot of different cultures. I mean, even between France and Germany, it is extremely different. But for sake of simplicity, I always refer to Europeans and Americans, even though we both know that there are tons of nuances inside of those words. But we're looking at the differences between people coming from the United States and people coming from the countries in Europe. So anyway, what surprises my American clients when they start working in, for example, France or Germany, they assume that if a senior leader, let's say a vice president, a CEO, co-founder, that kind of thing, as they want to move forward, well, the deal is then indeed moving forward, because that's how it generally works in the US. The senior person has the authority. They use the authority and the deal moves forward. Now, in countries like in France or in Germany, probably a lot of continental European countries as well, that same vice president saying yes is opening a process. It's not closing one. The decision still has to go through, like in French, the comité de direction, like the executive committee, possibly the works council, if we get, them involved in it. Sometimes legal, IT, it just kind of depends on the context and the project. Sometimes there's the broader management committee. And, none of this is like typical European bureaucracy. We're not talking about like administrative stuff here. We're talking about a different system that is working the way that it is supposed to work for the way that a lot of countries and a lot of cultures here in Europe work, meaning much more consensus-based. And so the decision isn't real until that consensus can be built, or at least have its foundations in place. Now, I have seen American sales teams completely lose the plot at this point. They get a yes from a higher up. They think they have a deal and they start kind of working a US style 30-day close. They're going in hard. They're pushing for it. And I've had people say, French clients say, a yes early on and then actually pull out of the deal because they said they were pushing us too hard. It was getting a little uncomfortable and we didn't feel comfortable moving forward. So, when the Americans are maybe like pushing for the signature, pushing for the kickoff date, pushing and trying to move these things forward fast, as things, often do move in the US, the French team starts going quiet because the questions that the Americans are asking and the actions that they're taking, they don't make sense inside the French system. Now, there's nothing to sign yet. Nothing's been formalized. They have said that they're aligned and moving forward, but they haven't actually formalized what that looks like together and to formalize the yes to that deal. Now, on the other side, French CEOs, they fly back from New York or wherever they're in the US, San Francisco, Miami, who knows? I just use New York often because I'm there more than some of the other places. Anyway, they fly back from their city of choice in the US, and they're convinced that they've just had real progress because the American team kept saying things like, yeah, this is awesome. This looks great. Send us something over. We're on the same page. Let's move forward, etc. And, in France, that level of warmth and enthusiasm from a senior executive would mean that there is genuine intent. It's that kind of engagement that gets driven into the executive committee, maybe like next week because they want to indeed move forward. So the French CEO hears it that way too. He doesn't expect to jump in and get started on the project next week. He expects that, the American execs are now going to advocate internally on their behalf, maybe the way that a French executive would. So American warmth and enthusiasm doesn't predict that kind of internal advocacy. It's simply, language for like, our options are open here. And it's not necessarily an early sign of internal momentum and things are really moving forward. I mean, how many times have I had clients come back from, these big events like CES, NRF, Stanley Morgan, South by Southwest, these kinds of things. And they say, yeah, we had a lot of demos. The people were really enthusiastic. And then they get back to France and then do the follow-up and like nothing moves forward. Again, it's options only language. It's not really a sign of any kind of internal momentum. This is kind of the part where it gets interesting, is that both of these systems work. And that's the part that most people miss when they're frustrated with the other side. The American, the leader decides and we go system makes sense once you look at what it's built on. American companies generally have lower switching costs, faster feedback loops than their counterparts in a lot of countries in Europe. Hiring and firing are easier in the US. Of course, it varies from state to state, but generally speaking, and compared to Europe, hiring and firing is easier. Course correcting is cheaper. Making mistakes is less dramatized. So, and the cultural premium is on action. So when the cost of changing direction is low, you can move on a decision early and adjust as you learn. And the system rewards that. Now, contrast that with, let's say French and German consensus first, decisions then system. We're running on a different set of inputs, like a whole other system. Switching costs are higher. Labor protections are stronger. Mistakes can be seen sometimes as personal failures. I've had a lot of people say it's very hard for a French CEO to admit that they've made a mistake. Teams tend to stay together longer than in the US, where we know that turnover is very high and very fast. And so that means in these French and German companies and maybe Europe compared to the US, that institutional memory is stronger as well. And that means that a decision that is made today, they'll have to live with that and live with that decision will have to live with those same people for years. So the cultural premium is on decisions that hold up and, stand the test of time, let's say. And this is something that, it's one of the 6 cultural dimensions that they talk about in the Geert Hofstede Institute is this relationship to time. France, for example, is much more long-term oriented than the US. And that means also that, reversing course, changing your mind, changing the direction that you're heading in, that can be expensive, both internally and in terms of reputation. So you build the consensus first and you commit once and you don't reopen the question every quarter or, sometimes in some American, every couple of weeks, every month or so. Other countries in Europe, Italy, the Nordic countries, the Netherlands, they each have their own variations on this. And like I said, every country is going to be different. But France and Germany are where I've seen this consensus first pattern the most consistently in my own work with the clients. And like I said, both systems are rational. It's just that each one works in its own system, its own little container, let's say. And so from the inside, the other one looks broken because it's solving for a different problem. And this is often where the frustrations come out between, the different countries when they're working together on transatlantic deals. Let me give you a concrete example here. I worked with an American SaaS company that had just acquired a small French software company. And it was about 6 or 8 weeks or so into the integration. And the American CEO, we sat down and we had a talk. And his words were something, his frustration was something along the lines of like, Christina, every single decision takes a meeting, and then every meeting takes another meeting. And why can't they just decide and get to work? We'll fix things later if we need to, but everything takes so long to start working on. And then, a couple of days later, I had a meeting with the French CTO of the acquired firm. So this was very interesting because it was really like getting inside intel from two sides of this project. And anyway, so the discussion with the French CTO was, something along the lines of, the Americans, they are going to break this company by changing direction every couple of weeks. I've got two people who are, they're going to finish in burnout. And I don't understand how anyone is supposed to build anything stable working this way. And so what we had here, again, two systems, two leaders inside the same company, conversations happening just a couple days apart, and each one was right inside their own system. And this is where the friction came from. Neither one could see the system that the other one was operating in. They were evaluating what the other person was doing and how the other person was working based on the way that they had been used to working inside their own system. And when two operating systems collide on a deal or an acquisition or a joint venture, this kind of thing, the cost, it can be enormous. Most of the failures that I get hired to autopsy come from the moment when the American side thought they had alignment from the meeting and started executing, while the French side thought the meeting was an early stage exploration and just starting to build the internal consensus that the deal would actually need in order to concretely move forward. Both sides walked away from the same room with different understandings of where things stood, but neither side knew that. And by the time someone asks, all right, where are we on this? Their paths have been diverging for weeks, maybe months. And it's a little like, let's imagine two airplanes that take off on parallel landing strips. They start off going in the same direction, but if each of those kind of, veers in a different direction just by 1 degree, by the time they finish those flights, one's landed in New York and one has landed in, Mexico City. And that's kind of the risk of what can happen when you think that you're aligned, but you're diverging. Now, I had a client a couple of years ago. This was a US tech company expanding into Germany who told their board after the first major meeting that the German prospect was, a quarter or two from the contract. 8 months later, that German company was still asking for technical documentation that hadn't been sent over because the American assumed that they were further along than they actually were in this decision-making process. And every signal that they were still in the evaluation phase had gone past him because, again, the American was looking at this through his American system and the Germans were operating inside their German system. So, on their side, they'd assumed he was the one stalling. On the German side, they assumed that the American was the one stalling. They weren't getting the documents, et cetera, et cetera. And they told a competitor that the American company didn't seem serious about the German market. And guess what happened? The competitor ended up closing the deal. And that's what this looks like in terms of like real money, in terms of real deals. A deal that should have closed, which was on its way to closing, in the end went to someone else, someone local, because nobody in the room realized that the two sides were keeping score on different scoreboards. What do you do about this? Now that you know and you're conscious of it, like concretely, what can you do? There's 3 things that I can recommend. The first one is the question that I make every single one of my clients ask in their first major meeting with someone on the other side of the Atlantic. After the leader or whoever you're dealing with says yes, says anything that equates to we're moving forward, the question is, who else needs to weigh in for this? Who else needs to weigh in on this for it to become a real deal? So you want to find out who are the people involved in the decision-making process. And if, in an American company, the answer might be no one, it's just me. And the person you're talking to has that authority. Move accordingly. In a French company, for example, the answer might be a list. It might be one other person. It might be 3 other people. And that list is your consensus map, if we can call it that. Working that list is where the actual deal is going to happen. So once you have it, you can stop guessing. You know who needs to see what kind of material, and you know how long or you can estimate, you can start imagining how long this timeline actually has to be. The second thing that I recommend is to time box the consensus, not the decision. American executives are used to scheduling decisions. We'll make a decision by Friday. That phrase doesn't necessarily translate directly across cultures. In a consensus system, you schedule the rounds of conversation that produce the decision, not a target date for the decision itself, unless you are pretty well into those rounds of conversation to produce the decision. Put the executive committee on your timeline. Put legal review on your timeline if that's something that's necessary. And when you kind of bake these in from the start of your process, you stop fighting the system and you start working with it despite the fact that it can be longer. Now, the third thing that I'm going to suggest is the one I'm going to say it costs me the least to teach and saves clients the most very often. And this is basically just to match the artifact to the system. Now, what on earth do I mean by this? I mean, match your artifact or your sales asset to the system that you're working in. Send a one-pager to the American who's going to skim it on his phone or her phone and then forward it maybe to a couple of colleagues. Send a real dossier with sections and argument structure, history, references, things like that to the French CEO who is going to look at it, bring it to his or her leadership team, discuss it with the strategic committee, all of that. And you basically have the same type of content, the same content itself, but you've got two different formats. A one-pager works well for an American audience, and then they can get more details or they can ask for more details if they want to see it. But if you just start by sending a one-pager over early in the process, when you're dealing with French companies, very often they will feel that there's not enough depth to move forward with a decision. If you send over a very long proposal deck with, 20 to 30 slides, American reaction is going to be TLDR, too long, didn't read. And I have seen deals turn around when companies stopped sending the same artifact to both audience and started thinking about what each audience actually needed in order to start moving forward. So, it basically comes down to, and this is just one specific concrete example of adapt to the culture that you're working in. Americans, they want it to be quick and easy to digest and very synthetic. The French, they need the details and they need the layout and working up to kind of the conclusion. And again, that is one of the very well-researched cultural differences is the way that we are persuaded is very different between these two cultures. So here's what I want you to take away from this episode. When a deal stalls or an acquisition just kind of runs aground, the first place to look is the operating system that you're each running. The competence and the commitment of the other side are usually fine. The system is where the friction comes from. And most of the time, both sides are doing exactly what their own system has told them to do for many, many years. They're acting in good faith. They're producing the best work that they know how to produce in the way that they are used to working. And that work, it just gets produced for two different decision-making frameworks, which is why they don't fit together when we come into a transatlantic deal. So the skill that's necessary here in transatlantic business is reading which building you're actually in. When I'm sitting in a meeting in New York, I'm running the American system. In Lyon or Grenoble, rather, I switched to the French one. And after 20 years of doing this, I can switch in about 30 seconds. And most of the people that I work with, they can learn it in a few months once they realize that it's a thing they need to learn. Now, this doesn't mean that after a few months they master it, but at least they learn to recognize what's happening. And once we've recognized what's happening, we can start fixing it. And like I said, both systems are rational. Each one works in its own system. The failure happens when you bring the wrong one into the wrong room and then blame the other side for not playing along. All right. In 2 weeks, we're going to have the next episode, which will come out. like I said, once you understand the system that decisions live inside, the next question is what people actually mean when they say yes. And I'll tell you right now, an American yes and a French we are rarely the same word. So if you're tracking your pipeline based on the yeses that you've been getting, your pipeline is probably lying to you. And that's where we are going next time. All right. Thank you very much for listening. This was kind of a longer episode, but we really needed to get into the details and the contrasts and what happens. So if you are listening to it still, I want to say thank you for getting to the end. And if this episode resonated with any of the deals that you are working on right now or that you have worked on in the past, send me a message, send me an email, send me a DM on LinkedIn. I pretty much live half my life on LinkedIn anyway. I will get it. I read every message I get about the podcast, and the questions that I get from you help shape what I cover next. So link for everything is in the show notes. This is Crossing the Atlantic. I'm Christina Rebuffet-Broadus, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks.